it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll be expressing my love for the contrarian and Izzy Award-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. I'll explain why all socialists should love him too, despite the fact that Greenwald is not a socialist, and perhaps not even a leftist. I'll also be considering the new post-left or anti-left trend that has emerged in a trollish way online. And I'll take an excerpt from Christine Louis-Dit-Sully's upcoming book, Transcending Racial Divisions, in order to understand the meaning of a Marxist historicism, and in order to help determine the degree to which taking an anti-left posture might be, or might not be, a necessary step towards reigniting a struggle for socialism. A few weeks back, a quote from Glenn Greenwald was tweeted out by a social media type at the Daily Caller. Greenwald had said the following: "I consider Tucker Carlson to be a socialist." Now, this is a cherry-picked quote that Greenwald had said half in jest, or more accurately, in order to make a rhetorical point. Here's what Greenwald actually said.
Obviously, the word socialist carries a lot of baggage from the Cold War. It evokes on purpose the Soviet Union or, Castro or Chavez, Pol Pot, people like that, kind of the Mao. But I think what you're seeing is this kind of hybrid socialism that really is about nothing more than trying to sandpaper the edges off of neoliberalism. And I, would describe a lot of people on the right as being socialists. I would consider Steve Bannon to be a socialist. I would consider the 2016 iteration of Donald Trump, the candidate, to be a socialist based on what he was saying. I consider Tucker Carlson to be a socialist.
Now, as somebody who understands socialism from a Marxist perspective, Greenwald is wrong. In fact, from my perspective, the quote in context is even more wrong than the quote in isolation. In isolation, it reads as a provocation, and only as a provocation. It is contrarian and nothing else. But in context, you can see that Greenwald has done some real thinking about what socialism means in the current political moment, and that he has come to a counterintuitive conclusion that isn't wrong, given the assumptions that really are commonly held by many. If we conceive of socialism as a movement for redistribution and regulation within a neoliberal order, then Tucker Carlson might very well be, at times, a socialist. However, I think this popular understanding of the term socialism is in error. So, in my usual flat-footed way, I tweeted a correction to Greenwald. Dear Glenn Greenwald, Tucker Carlson is not a socialist. Socialism is not identical to being anti-neoliberal. Socialism aims at the international emancipation of the working class. Greenwald tweeted a couple of responses. Here's one of them. Did you read any of the articles I wrote on this topic or listen to the full context of the interview where this was discussed? Or are you proudly responding to the 6-word snippet that the Daily Caller social media manager fed you to get you to do what you're doing?
Thank you, sir. May I have another? Thank you, sir. May I have another? Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Greenwald responded too quickly to my tweet. He shut down what might have been at least a slightly more interesting exchange, and he made me feel sad. But despite this, I still love Glenn Greenwald. Here's why. Greenwald doesn't have to be nice or even fully right in order for his writings and provocations to be useful. All I require from him is that he acts in good faith, which is not the same thing as being nice or being right. He's a journalist first, not a left theorist. I don't look to him with the expectation that he's going to deepen my theoretical understanding of the world, but only that he'll tell me about real-world events and raise issues that others are unwilling to raise. But there's another reason that I like Glenn Greenwald so much, and this is it. I thoroughly dislike the methods of his liberal critics. For instance, Sam Cedar at the Majority Report recently took Greenwald to task.
All right, let's listen to this clip.
Declare yourself non-binary or trans, you kind of catapult up the ladder of oppression in a way that absolutely confers very concrete benefits, and anyone who denies that is being dishonest.
Pause it.
Absolutely.
I just want to be dishonest here for a moment. What? Like, how does...
What concrete benefits? Name them.
Again, it reeks of what I heard 10 to 15 years ago of gay people are looking for special rights. I mean, maybe you get, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, like, maybe there are essay contests out there that maybe you can enter if you've gone
like
through.
We're in an aesthetic critique of liberal online culture, and like but there's not a discussion about policy.
But wait a sec. But that may be motivating that particular speaker. But the story of trans people getting special rights is a fundamentally reactionary right-wing position.
What Sam Cedar did here was rhetorically associate Greenwald's statement with the position of those who opposed gay marriage and or the introduction of other legal rights and protections for LGBTQ people. While Emma Vigeland, perhaps slightly more honestly, argued that Greenwald was overly concerned with oppression hierarchies that only exist in online subcultures. However, Vigeland could have known exactly what Greenwald was talking about if she'd listened to his complete statement.
The other, component of this that also has been declared off limits to talk about, even though I think, anyone politically engaged knows very well that it's true, is that while in certain sectors of society, of course, you're going to experience hardship and discrimination and bigotry and even potentially physical attack if you identify as trans and you live your life as trans. But there are other sectors of society, academia, national media discourse, cultural liberalism, and enclaves of liberalism, where absolutely identifying as something other than a straight person, as identifying as queer, like you were saying earlier, or as non-binary, or as trans, confers very significant benefits. In fact, there are now codes about how you can and should critique someone, and maybe even refrain from critiquing them if they fall into one of these categories that is declared sufficiently marginalized that to critique them is almost inherently illegitimate. It gives you a leg up in terms of how you are judged to have what your standing is to speak on certain issues, that the minute you declare yourself non-binary or trans, you kind of catapult up the ladder of oppression in a way that absolutely confers very concrete benefits, and anyone who denies that is being dishonest.
To give this even more context, Greenwald went on to talk about Jude Doyle, about how Jude Doyle was demanding that Substack overhaul its policies so that people like Greenwald, who he called a transphobic bigot, no longer were offered money up front for joining Substack. To be clear, Jude called Glenn a transphobic bigot on the basis of an essay Glenn wrote decrying how a prominent member of the ACLU was pushing the institution away from its core mission to protect civil liberties, including, most prominently, the right to free speech. He was decrying how the ACLU, through one particular member, advocated for the suppression of a book on the subject of detransitioning. Jude didn't say that Greenwald was wrong to be a free speech absolutist, or that Glenn underestimated the psychological and political damage books like the one written by Abigail Shrier did to transgender people and the movement for their rights. But he asserted that Greenwald was irrationally afraid of transgender people and implied that Greenwald was only motivated to stand up for free speech because of his supposed transphobia. If you just spend 5 minutes reading the work of Jude Doyle, pick a blog post at random, you'll find that Greenwald's assertion that within the media sphere, people can gain material benefits from climbing the ladder of oppression will seem sensible, even obvious. But we shouldn't always trust what seems obvious, nor should we let our reactions to one person or even several people, guide our conclusions. Despite Jude Doyle's clearly opportunistic use of his victim status, transgender people are more likely to be discriminated against, even within media institutions, than to gain material advantages due to their gender identity.
First times that I really, it's funny because despite the recent allegations that I'm like this, anti-trans warrior or whatever, the reality is I barely have ever spoken about the trans debate, like literally almost never, in part because it was just something that I just instinctively supported for the reason that I said earlier, which is that it's just okay. My philosophy is if the person who's born a biological male identifies as a female, they ought to be able to live their lives as a female and have society respect that, have the law respect that. Like, it didn't seem that complicated to me. And the only times, even up until now, that I've ever written about it were in the context of just free speech issues, when like a book about trans issues gets banned from Amazon, and I write about it from the perspective of free discourse and free speech rather than the trans issue itself.
Even so, it wouldn't undermine Greenwald's primary point. Lying about, smearing, and censoring people you disagree with, trying to drive them out of the media industry, might serve individuals seeking to win a zero-sum game. It might further their own careers. But these tactics undermine the struggle for social justice and for transgender rights. These tactics make the people who use them look terrible, even when they win. These tactics are off-putting to everyone when they're on the receiving end of them, and even to many who might otherwise agree with Jude Doyle or Sam Seder politically. The currently dominant political practice of what appears to be the left is one that does not serve the interests of the political struggle for transgender rights under capitalism, and it certainly does nothing for the struggle for socialism. Rather, the left that resorts to these sorts of smears, to this sort of low propaganda, creates conditions that contribute to the growing authoritarian climate within our society overall. They're helping to suppress the struggle for socialism.
In terms of white privilege, this is not a discussion. You have lost that one.
I am talking about terms that serve the truth. Those are the terms.
When the left embraces this approach to politics and critique, when we decide that someone like Greenwald is an enemy rather than merely being occasionally wrong, we create a backlash. And over the last decade of this approach to leftism, a decade of cancel culture, the backlash is running deep. It is largely because the left finds itself predisposed to use these sorts of tactics that an admittedly very small segment of its supposedly most committed and radical adherents, that is, the left's most radical people, have split off into a formal opposition. That is, it is because of the backlash that an anti-left left is emerging. For example, Elena Louisa Lang is a senior researcher at the University of Zurich and one of the many Marxist scholars who co-authored a book entitled The Conformist Rebellion, Marxist Critiques of the Contemporary Left. She will be a guest on an upcoming podcast, and she sent me a PDF of an essay she wrote, along with Joshua Pickett DePoli, I think that's how you say his name, entitled The Middle Class Leviathan, Corona, the Fascism, Blackmail, and the Defeat of the Working Class. In their essay, Elena and Joshua characterize the current left as middle class, and specifically as PMC. They blame the left's acquiescence to the lockdowns, the left's embrace of the culture war through cancel culture, the left's multitude of failures, on this economic fact. But the idea that the left is middle class or is composed of PMC Karens is not new, and while it's not necessarily untrue, in the 21st century, the question of the class character of the left has a different meaning than it did in the 19th or even in the 20th centuries. So, for instance, Bordiga had concerns about the class composition of the left, or more particularly of the party, because he believed that the most advanced sectors of the working class, along with a vanguard of socialists who were committed to the party's revolutionary line, were responsible for the revolution. Commitment to the right theory was more important than the interests that arose through one's class position, whether proletariat or petty bourgeois, because the immediate concern of Marxists like Bordiga did not involve what one's attitude should be regarding merely symbolic political gestures, but rather had to do with how to both occupy the factories, coordinate a new mode of production led by the working class and through the party, and take state power. The Marxist left in 1919 planned on remaking society by overcoming what they thought was the root of capitalist production. For Bordiga, the aim was to break from what seemed like a scientific social law, to break from the logic of commodity production. Today, just as in his time, the majority of Marxists don't agree. Social democracy appeared as the final horizon, and beating absolutism was far from assured in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. But today, the old monarchies are dead, or so transformed as to be unrecognizable, and social democracy seems as utopian as communism or immortality. If we ask why today's Marxists, that is, the remains of the 60s New Left and its academic Gen X and millennial progenies, are captured by the left wing of capital, our answer will have to go far beyond analyzing this left's supposed class position. Marx's struggle can never be deterministic, even when it holds that capitalist relations are strictly determined by the logic of commodity production. Capitalism won't develop into socialism on its own. There is no socialist interest that exists as a particular class interest under capitalism, nor will there ever be. The working classes were always thought to be revolutionary because they were thought to have no particular interests under capitalism. For Rosa Luxemburg in 1919 and earlier, the question was whether there was interest in and understanding of socialism in the factories. For us, the question is whether such an interest might exist online or in soon-to-be published books. If our answer is no, then how are we to look elsewhere? If the answer is no, then we have ceased thinking and acting ourselves. In her book, Transcending Racial Divisions, Christine Louis-Dit-Sully argues that we historicize our conceptions of race. She notes that, according to Frank Snowden, racial prejudice, in ancient Rome for instance, or in ancient Greece, was not an issue. Although in the past they made a distinction between Greeks and non-Greeks, individuals were judged by their own character, quality, and excellence in living the good life, and not by their racial purity. The point is not that the Greeks were in some way morally advanced, but rather to highlight the fact that there are other ways of thinking, and that society and its concepts develop historically. What Dit-Sully and Snowden point out about race, we should understand about the left. Which brings us back to Greenwald. The reason not to embrace him as a leader for a new socialist movement is that he accepts the present too completely. The horizon of his thought, at least if it is to be judged through his writings, is the current bourgeois legal system and institutions. However, unlike much of the supposed left, he can at least notice the historical changes that are taking place. He sees the left's own regression into authoritarianism, our own capitalist realism, more clearly than we do ourselves. What we cannot afford to do is take up a position in the culture war that the left is trapped in, neither as woke scolds nor as daring contrarians. That isn't to say we shouldn't stand up for the incomplete bourgeois values that are necessary, if not sufficient, for radical transformation to take place, nor does it mean that we should look the other way when one of our own is attacked and smeared by middle-class opportunists. But what it does mean is that it's possible to love Greenwald without becoming him, and it does mean that being post-left or anti-left cannot replace the struggle to become a socialist. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.